Hi everyone from Dunrovin Ranch in early November, kind of a mid-November, November 18th, 2 o'clock in the afternoon. I have with me again Larry Manch, who is the head of the Montana Innocence Project, a professor at the University of Montana, and an expert historian on great American trials. And we're delighted to have you back, Larry.
My pleasure.
Yeah, we really had fun last time with the Almanac trial that was one of Abe Lincoln's most famous trials. And this last couple of weeks, we have been focused on Lizzie Borden. Mm-hmm. And wow, what an interesting trial, what an interesting event. It raised an enormous number of issues for us.
Good.
Okay.
Let's dive into them.
Yeah, okay. So a woman being tried for murder right around the turn of the century, right when women's suffrage, the temperance movement was in full swing, a lot of milieu about all of that. And so the questions that arose for us is within that context, first of all, there was the issue of juries and suffrage. It seemed like those are not connected. You could have the right to vote and still not have the right to be on a jury. Could you explain that to us?
Well, this was 1892 was the murder, and 1893 was the trial. So I'm not certain that suffrage had been enacted yet. I think that came later.
Well, several western states.
Several, including Massachusetts.
Including
Wyoming.
Utah, Wyoming.
Okay,
Yep.
so, and I know that suffrage had actually taken place on a trial basis for just a few years, I think in Massachusetts, and then it was rescinded again, and then it came back nationally. So it is an interesting area, but you're certainly right about the jury. All male jury. There wasn't any question it was going to be a male jury. And then the other thing about that's different from what we know today is that there was a panel of 3 judges, and so they sort of worked together, and 2 of the 3 could overrule the third. And it was interesting when they ruled on objections, for example, or the admissibility of evidence. They actually had to vote and just determine whether things came in, and that's what, in my view, made the difference in this trial. The evidence that didn't come in, which I think was probably the reason why she was acquitted.
Very interesting. Before we go to that, and we wanted to ask you what you thought was the most pertinent evidence. There seemed to be a lot of it. Go back to this issue of jury. When women's suffrage passed, that did not necessarily open up juries to women's participation. Is that correct?
That's correct, because suffrage was state by state, jurisdiction by jurisdiction, and much like voting today. States are allowed latitude in determining the rules and procedures. That's why we have so much trouble, for example, in Florida, because they have a different system than they might have somewhere else. And so a lot of it would depend on not only did you need to be a male to serve on a jury, but you need, of course, to be registered to vote, and you needed to be a landowner or a business owner in lots of different places.
A landowner and both.
And right, and that carried over from the old idea that the males particularly, but businessmen and landowners, this goes all the way back to Jefferson's time. Those folks would rise to the top. Those would be the cream of the society, and the smartest and the best and the brightest, and those are the folks you wanted to serve on juries to do their civic duty. Well, that skewed attitude and outlook gave us juries like we saw in the Lizzie Borden case. For better or for worse, that's what we ended up with. So different rules came in place, and of course that's a whole nother topic. But it's the same with Jim Crow laws in the South, where states were allowed to say, well, yes, you can vote. We understand the Constitution and the amendment and everything, but you need to be able to, read or write or own property or all those sorts of things, all those tests, which lots of African Americans would fail, and they knew that. So in Massachusetts, a different set of criteria, but the results really were just as dramatic.
So then, ultimately, there was a national women's suffrage law. What about a law opening up juries? Was that, again, jurisdiction by jurisdiction, and continues to be that way to today?
Well, we have Supreme Court decisions which have interpreted on the basis of due process over the years. but we didn't really get juries, juries of inclusion of color, for example, until really recently in our lifetime, the 60s and 70s and 80s. And in a place like Montana, for example, local local municipalities and jurisdictions, the clerk of court is the person who's elected, who works at the courthouse, who determines the pool from which prospective jurors are going to be pulled. Well, in a pretty well-known case out of Montana, where you had a Native American defendant up outside of Great Falls, and there were no natives on the final jury panel, and that was challenged. And the reason the clerk of court said is because we contact potential jury members by phone. And some folks on the reservation or out in the country didn't have phones, so they were automatically eliminated. That was challenged as unconstitutional, as a violation of due process, and the challenge was upheld because we have a right to a jury of your peers. Whether or not they have a telephone makes no difference. Right. So things change, all kinds of things change in different jurisdictions, right. And over the years, sometimes we make progress and sometimes we don't.
Yeah. I find it really interesting that this is still at the jurisdictional level.
It is.
That because I looked up on the web, I asked the question, do you have to be a registered voter to serve on a jury? And the answer is no in a lot of places.
In Montana you do, in a lot of places you don't. Yeah, that's right. And then how those jurors are selected. Yeah. Lots of places, old time where the old time systems are used in courthouses, they still have those old where they spin the wheel, right. they spin the bucket and pull your name out, and now it's different in a lot of places. But a jury of your peers is what the goal is, what the Constitution calls, and to argue that a bunch of white males, all much older than Lizzie, were somehow her peers, right. is pretty debatable.
Right. Well, that's really what struck us.
Right.
Was wow.
Right.
And it's not something we had thought about before. But let's stay on this topic of women just for a moment. There were several times in the readings that we had. It was not so apparent in the History Channel's hour-long movie, which we all watched together, which was interestingly, since it was a historical documentary, we didn't find the differences so much as we had in Lincoln's trial with the more dramatic fictional interpretation.
Right.
So there was a little bit closer to what we found in the readings. But at several times, her gender it seemed to play a role. One of them was that she was, on the defense side, they depicted her as an upstanding Christian woman, and this just was completely outside the realm of what she would be, thought to be able to even do.
Yes.
And then on the other side, on the prosecution side, there was, I don't know whether it was actually in the trial or maybe the newspaper depictions, was that this could only have been done by a mad woman who let her emotions take over her and her passions, so that they both sides were using her femininity. And it raised the question for us about women's trials in general during that period of time. And the fact that there was no women's penitentiary nearby, no jail nearby, that it seemed like the courts didn't know how to handle a woman very well, that it was an unusual thing.
Yeah, I think that's really true, because it was a very unusual situation, plus it was so sensational. So every decision that was made, every statement that was made was magnified. Right. And the other thing that's unusual, luckily for us, from a historical point of view, we have lots of transcripts, so we can read what was said. We couldn't do that, for example, in the Lincoln trial.
Right.
But the other thing is there were different levels of the proceedings that took place. So first the inquest, and then the probable cause hearing, which led to the indictment, and then the trial itself. And Lizzie testified at the first two, so you can tell by the questions that are put to her and the type of testimony that was presented, for example, from her family physician, about temperament and about her age and her marital status even, and how she got along with her stepmother was a particularly key thing. All things that today we'd say, well, they might be important, but it seems a little bit backward to emphasize those things so much. I think that what you raise about the Christian point of view is really particularly striking. And the judge instructed that jury that, you can determine that a person who's raised as a Christian and is a practicing Christian, it's probably outside her character to commit something like this.
Yeah.
Which, and to be instructed that as a matter of law was one of the biggest breaks that Lizzie ever got, and I think so. We're talking about sexuality and femininity, but also sort of 19th century views on the church and Christianity and faith all came together, and sometimes it hurt her, but in the end it really helped her.
Right. So the three-judge panel, that was an interesting aspect of this. Could you go a little bit more in depth in that? How, for example, their instructions to the jury, which it seemed to be very critical in the fact that they came back so quickly with a not guilty verdict. Which of the judges, was that under a consensus that they do that?
My understanding, it would be under a consensus. Now, in most jurisdictions in modern times, we have codified jury instructions, but so that there's a book of jury instructions, and the lawyers and the judges from any particular jurisdiction take those instructions from that book. They've been approved. But in those days, and really up until, say, the 1970s, lawyers would argue about jury instructions, and they had to be presented and offered, and then the judge would determine. Lots of times you'd see historically an old jury instruction that's presented, defense exhibit proposed instruction number 1 or prosecution's proposed exhibit number 2, and there'll be lines crossed out and other language inserted by the judge, so they'll give it as and modify if they're going to give it at all. It was a huge thing, and it was seen as such an unfair thing across jurisdictions and across state lines even. So eventually that's all been codified to make it more uniform.
And when you say the word codified, you mean in state statutes?
Yes, I do.
So there are codes that you can reference.
It kind of works that way. So what will happen will be there'll be the Judges Association, the Prosecutors Association, Defense Attorneys Association, in conjunction with the state and local bar associations, and they'll go to the legislature and seek approval for passing a set of uniform jury instructions. So it's sort of like the way lawyers are disciplined. Well, the legislature has let the bar association discipline itself when an attorney does something bad.
Right.
And it's the same with jury instructions. They figure that's your business, but we're going to enable you to do that.
Right.
And that's the way it works today.
Wow. So why the three judges? What was
that was really a holdover from the old days. Now remember, we're in Massachusetts, so it's deep history, even going all the way back before we were a nation, all the way back to Salem witch trials. So a panel of judges was not only a holdover from the old days in North America, but it was a holdover from England. And and judges were seen as having a special role and an important role. In the old days, the representatives of the king. So oftentimes a panel of judges were seen so that you could make sure we're getting it right because we're doing something on behalf of the crown. Well, here, there was no king, of course, but we still wanted, the idea was we still want to get things right. 3 legal minds are better than 1 or better than 2, and we needed, of course, 3 to break ties. So you don't see that anymore. But
is it allowed still?
I don't know of any jurisdiction that has that now, but you'd see it all the way up until into the 1930s and 40s for sure.
Really?
Yeah.
Very, very interesting. So just from a procedural perspective, these 3 juries would openly discuss to come to a consensus in court while
3 judges.
The 3 judges would openly discuss issues in front of the proceedings?
I don't think so. I think what typically would happen would be one of the judges was the chief judge or the lead judge, and that judge, for example, it would be agreed upon that he, always a he, would rule on objections, for example. Right. Now, objections, from what we know of modern trials, what we see on TV or in movies, the lawyer stands up, I object, and there's maybe a brief argument. Sometimes it took place that way, but sometimes not. And you remember that also sometimes judges would allow attorneys to speak directly to the jury right in the middle of the trial, which would never be allowed now, but that was kind of common then. So they would typically elect a chief judge who would rule on anything from the bench and preside, but the other 2 would listen. And then, of course, before the trial and during breaks or in the evening or whatever, they would put their heads together at any particular issue that was still outstanding.
And you said he, which brings up another issue. And I've got so many issues here on women's issues.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if we can invite you back to talk about the evolution of women in the judicial system all the way along.
That would be a good topic. Yep, that would be a lot of fun.
Yeah.
You can invite me back anytime you want. And whether I say something right or wrong, I'll speak up.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you're talking about them participating as jurors, as attorneys, as judges, as prosecutors. I mean, and all of these had to be, it started out all male, did it not? Except for the possible defendant.
All male, and even the journalists who covered it, of course, were all male reporters. So the press that was going out was written by males, and certainly women were reading newspaper accounts, but lots of men were reading accounts as well. So public opinion, in large part, I think, was shaped from the male perspective as well.
Right. I think we're onto a topic that people would really like to dig into.
We might be. That's good. That's good.
Yeah, it's really fun. Okay, the other issue that surfaced repeatedly was one of mental illness in her trial, and could you address how mental illness was adjudicated during that period of time?
Well, mental illness in the history of the law is really, really complicated because what we kind of loosely throw around as the insanity defense existed, but in about 3 or 4 different forms. And when you go to law school, for example, you might spend a week on each of the different standard for a particular model of the, quote, insanity defense. Montana, for example, has abolished the insanity defense. So you cannot claim that a person is insane and therefore shouldn't be found not guilty, although you can claim a diminished capacity and a failure to appreciate. But that's another very complicated topic. I think what's most interesting about the Borden case is, remember, there were family physicians who testified.
Right.
Some of them were, and family friends. One of the doctors lived right across the street.
Right.
And was one of the first on the scene, or his wife, I think, was the first on the scene, so they knew the family, and they knew Lizzie quite well. They knew her temperament and knew her medical history, at least to some degree. But the defense didn't make any kind of a claim that Lizzie was out of her mind, or if she did it, you should excuse it because she didn't know what she was doing.
Right.
And you have to wonder, really, about, because as we were talking about before, there was at least rumblings before the trial even started that if anybody who had to do this had to have been out of their mind.
Yeah.
Okay, well, so you have to wonder how much Lizzie played a part in instructing her lawyers or in working with her lawyers as to say, I didn't do it and that's the end of it. I'm not going to claim any kind of diminished mental capacity or anything like that. I think, knowing what I think I know about Lizzie and her personality and her kind of will and her force, I wouldn't be surprised at all if that's what happened. If she said, I didn't do it, and we're not going to argue any kind of insanity defense. But the rumblings were always there, and I certainly think that the feeling in the community was this had to have been a terrible, horrible, insane person. Couldn't have been a Christian person, and we're going to find Lizzie not guilty, and of course, the crime never was solved.
So let's go back to the pertinent evidence. You alluded to a piece of evidence that was not brought in, that you think was important, and so let's just talk about what do you think were the most important pieces of evidence that played out in this trial?
Well, I think that the way it worked, they had this inquest, a coroner's inquest, which we still...
That would have been in the fall. They had that it happened in August. And
yeah, I think it was pretty quick after it happened.
Yeah, that's what it seemed to happen quickly.
And while certainly Lizzie was a suspect from almost the very start, she didn't have counsel at the time, and she went down and she testified, or she at least gave a statement. That statement ultimately was decided by the judge not to be allowed in a trial.
And that statement survives.
That statement survives. And there are lots of discrepancies in there and confusing things. Now, and you know from reading, or you might remember from reading, that her family doctor then later sort of explained that away because she
Was distraught.
yeah, but she was given medicine, remember,
Right, that's
morphine,
right, morphine.
and morphine, and well, that might have made her confused, and she was on edge, and she just lost her parents, and all kinds of things. But the judge ultimately didn't rule. The judges, I should say, didn't allow the jury to hear that. Although you have to wonder how much the jury knew from reading the newspapers going into the trial. And in a pretty small town, I would think, I don't know for sure, I would think Lizzie's words were out there. But so the judges didn't rule that the jury could not hear her statement because of any kind of a diminished ability because of the morphine or doctor's care or her distraught nature. And they didn't even really rule that it wasn't allowed in because it was an admission or a confession. They really relied on the Fifth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which is different than the 14th Amendment that we so often focus on today and how much of our jurisprudence has developed today, the 14th Amendment. And they ruled it on the Fifth Amendment did not come in. Now this is the 1890s, so the Fifth Amendment doesn't say anything about the right to counsel.
And the Fifth Amendment is one about self-incrimination. Is that not correct?
You have the right to remain silent.
The right to remain silent.
That's right, among other things, double
Right.
jeopardy and
Right.
due process in the Fifth Amendment, not
Right.
in the 14th.
Right.
So they ruled it doesn't come in. They said it's not really an admission, it's more of a denial. She didn't have counsel. The Fifth Amendment, we're going to apply that, even though that's a federal amendment and not a state. There's no such thing as incorporation into the states yet. That came much, much later. So on the basis of that, in my view, that panel of judges worked really hard to keep Lizzie's inquest statement out. And I think when we look at that today, lots and lots of historians would say, or legal scholars would say, boy, if a jury hears some of the things she said, which were more than likely not true or not altogether true, she may very well have been convicted. I think that was the best break that she got, was that testimony was excluded. And when it is excluded, that just simply means it's not coming into evidence, it's not admitted into evidence, and jury members, even if you know what it is, you put it out of your mind and you can't consider it when you deliberate.
Right.
Deliberate.
So, two things that you just said raise questions in my mind. One, there wasn't a request for change of venue.
Right.
You know, that there was so much publicity. I mean, but it had gone all the way to Boston. I mean, it wasn't just
Right.
right there. And isn't it Fall Springs? Yeah.
Fall River.
Fall River.
Right.
But why was it? Why?
You know, I think that there were very good grounds for a change of venue, or whatever the equivalent was back in those days. But I think that the lawyers must have said, we believe in our client, she's from here, she's a reputable person, it's going to look bad if we think we can't have a trial in her hometown, and this is where we're going to make our stand. I have to believe that was part of the strategy.
Right.
I really truly believe that. It paid off.
And was Fall River small enough that the three panel of judges would have known the family?
Oh, I think so, yeah.
Yeah, that's kind of...
Yep, yeah. I can't remember now where all the judges came from, but they were from the area.
Right.
And, you know, it was a very, very wealthy family, and the defense team, two very bright and famous and very famous individuals, the former governor, after all. So
Yeah.
they had a lot of prestige working for him.
Yeah. So one piece of evidence that it came up, but at least I couldn't find where anybody elaborated on it, was the coat at Mr. Borden's head. Mm-hmm. That they couldn't find any blood on Lizzie, and according to my reading, there was only an 8 to 13 minute window in which she could have done away with or cleaned up herself. Is that not right?
I think that's about right. I usually hear 13 minutes or so, give or take.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that does seem like an awfully short time to clean up the amount of blood that had to have been involved.
It just doesn't seem... I have to think that you're right, and that the jury had to really strongly consider that.
Yeah.
And one of the problems that the prosecution they had to take these holes in the case, and they couldn't explain them.
Yeah.
They never could explain the lack of blood.
Yeah.
They never could explain the lack of the axe handle and only the axe.
Yeah.
and they just weren't able to. And so it's interesting too, while the defense attorney made the distinction between direct and circumstantial evidence, you might remember from reading, the defense didn't, either one is enough to convict, and was enough to convict then, but the defense attorneys just left that linger in the minds of the juries that this is all circumstantial. There's no direct testimony, there's no eyewitness, there's no confession, and there's no one who saw what happened. Therefore, by inference, all circumstantial evidence is weak. And it was weak in those, in the blood and the clothing and the location and the time of day, and all the speculation about Lizzie and her personal life and her relationship with the family. All circumstantial, none of it direct, and never been explained even to this day.
Yeah. It's really an enigma, isn't it?
It is. It's one of those cases where you'd give anything to have had a camera so we could determine this,
Right.
see what really happened, you know?
Right.
And everyone has their own feelings and their own suspicions, but we won't know for sure.
Yeah. Well, what are yours?
Yeah.
You've studied it, and what are your suspicions?
I think it's hard to come up with any other conclusion other than that she did it. I'm pretty convinced that she did it. It's such a strange family, and the relationship with her sister, and with the maid, you know,
Right.
and her stepmother, and her own behavior. But then again, and you know, when I say her behavior, also her statements. Some of them made sense, and some of them didn't. Very odd. But no other suspect, really, no other credible suspect has ever been put forth, has ever come forward.
Right.
There's never been another person who say, I did it. There's never been even rumors of other people that ever had any credibility that we were followed up on. So,
Right.
you know, I tend to think that she was guilty as charged, and she kept a great secret with her and her sister and the maid over all these years, but I wasn't there.
Yeah. So you think that the sister knew, and
I
the
think
maid perhaps, Maggie.
I think so, yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
Now, if you
But
were...
there was a falling out between what was the plant name? Maple, the second house that they purchased.
Maplethorpe or something?
Maplethorpe, yeah.
Yeah. I think, you know, if this theory is right that Lizzie really was guilty, well, her sister almost had to have been in on the secret.
Right.
But even if they had a falling out 10 or 15 years later, and even if they kept that, you know, how could Emma then come forward and say, well, I lied at trial, and I've been covering for my sister the entire time, and she really did it, and I knew about it? She couldn't very well do that. Right. So in that sense, you know, Lizzie had something over Emma, and they both had something over each other. Now, whether the maid knew or not, you know, the maid's testimony was kind of helpful in some ways and not helpful in other ways. But she also went to her grave, never changing her story officially.
And she went to her grave here in Montana, didn't she?
She did. Amazing. She did. Yeah. Yeah. I think she went back home to Ireland for a short period of time,
Right.
but then came back, excuse me, and went to Anaconda. And, you know, the 1910s and 20s and 30s, the Anaconda
Roaring.
company is roaring, and there's lots
Right.
of people, and she found work right away. And her husband worked at the not in the mine, but at the smelter,
Yeah.
at the smelter, and lived out her life and never officially changed her story.
Wow. This is very interesting.
It is amazing.
Yeah. So one of the things that intrigued me was how this endures. There is a forum of people out there, and there are, I mean, I went to the forum just to check it out. I thought, who are these people that keep, they keep wringing their hands over Lizzie Borden? And I mean to tell you, it's active. That I went on the 15th. There were postings on the 15th. There was, I mean, people just really obsessing over little pieces of information. And
Every little thread is a different
yes,
topic.
every little thread's a different
the axe
topic.
handle and the blood and the confession and the
yes. I mean,
Yeah.
it's almost like a little industry out there that
It is.
and there are Lizzie Borden societies. I mean, there are groups. I mean, I could see that forming around Lincoln. After all, he was a president and a historical. I mean, his history went way beyond that trial. But Lizzie is just confined to that one incident. So,
It is.
what do you attribute this to?
And not to mention movies and plays and books, which
And songs, ditties.
songs. Oh yeah, that's right. That's right. So, well, I think that you know, when you look at this whole thing as a whole, there's so many circumstances just fascinate people. And it's not just that there was a brutal couple of murders. They really were brutal. But it's the fact that, you know, a wealthy family, a woman who's really looks guilty in a lot of ways to a lot of people, but she was acquitted and walked away. You know, never married, family of wealth, strange family history, no other suspects. There's just so many things about it that continue to fascinate. But in that regard, I'm with you. There's lots and lots and lots of cases that have lots of those components too.
Right.
People don't remember those, or they're not famous across the state, much less the, you know. But Lizzie Borden is one of those people that fascinates us. You know, you look at, if you're like me, you look up Lizzie Borden and you see those same 6 or 7 or 8 photographs,
Right.
and you look into those eyes and you wonder what she's thinking, and
Yeah.
is she smiling or is she not smiling, or
Yeah.
what is it that she knows? What is it that she went to her grave with? And I think all those things add up to the fact that it's one of those great, great mysteries, and I'm as fascinated as anybody.
Yeah, yeah. So tell me, were there any legal issues that came out of this whole incident?
No, not really, because had the verdict been guilty, there would have been appeals, but of course the prosecution can't appeal, so there was none. I've looked and tried to figure out what the attorneys had to say, or if they wrote about it later, and I haven't really had any success. In other trials, you know, lawyers or judges or jury members come forward and write about it, or at least in letters. I don't really find a lot of those things. We saw that in the Lincoln trial in the
Right.
1840s, but we
Right.
don't really see it in Lizzie Borden in the 1890s.
Right.
So it's very strange. I tend to think that, again, it goes back to what we were talking about earlier, that this Fall River, Massachusetts was a pretty tight community, and I think the feeling was, what happens here is going to stay right here, and we're going to put this sad chapter behind us and move on. And this community hasn't been able to move on. They'll never move on. It's still a tourism thing, but I think the people that were involved, I think that they said, let's put that behind us, and never spoke about it. And I, you know, whether it was illegal, whether it was an appeal like you asked about, or whether it's just their reminiscences, because I just don't see a lot of that out there.
Yeah.
Amazing.
But there were no great speeches, or I mean, it seemed like there was a confused trial at some level. That, you know, with the directions to the jury.
And you're right, it's not known as there were no landmark decisions that came out of
Right.
it. There's no obvious errors. Clearly, the judge did 2 or 3 things that helped Lizzie,
Right.
but judges have discretion. Judges preside and they rule, and if it hurt the case, it hurt the case.
Yeah.
So no one was accused of perjury. You know, if we try it today, it's tried a lot differently. Of course it is going to be, because there's going to be forensic, there's going to be blood, there's going to be DNA.
Right.
You know, we talk about Maggie, for example. Well, if the Borden sisters paid Maggie to keep quiet, which has long been the rumor, one rumor, well, let's find out about Maggie's finances. How did she travel back to Ireland and all the way back to America, and could she afford that? She was a single lady at that time who didn't have any money. How could she afford that? We could find that out today.
Right.
Nobody found it out then. The trial would be much, much, much different
Yeah.
today with
Yeah.
those sets of circumstances. And I think Lizzie would be in a lot of trouble if it was tried today. But that's something that's another reason for why the fascination, I think.
Well, and the fascination of 3 women keeping a secret for that long is also, I mean, that's sort of hard to think about.
3 women, and 2 of those women are sisters, and they both remain single, and they live under the same roof for many, many years together.
Yeah.
And then die within a week or 8 days of each other.
Right.
In the, what,
But
1927?
estranged at that point.
Estranged at that point, yeah, that's right. You know, in 1927, now imagine how different the world was from the Victorian 1890s. You know, Lizzie was born in 1860, the year Lincoln was elected, a year before the Civil War. She dies, this notorious person, in 1927.
Right.
The Jazz Age, airplanes are flying overhead.
Right.
Everything's changed.
Right.
And can you imagine? You can't imagine the
No.
things that were going through that lady's mind.
Right.
And again, that's part of what we're fascinated by and continue to be.
Well, people, I don't see any questions, but I see a lot of comments.
All right.
Yeah,
Are they saying we know what we're talking about? Or
they're having a good time. What happened in Fall Rivers is supposed to happen, stay in Fall Rivers, sounds like it, they said.
Yeah.
Was Maggie the maid? Oh, yeah, here it is, she's the maid. They're just talking with, trying to bring up the issues. Well, so the reason you chose this as a great American trial is really just its infamy.
Yep, it
I mean,
is.
It's just the fact that it's something everybody knows, and it really.
Yeah, I think so. That's right. And I think a lot of people have an idea. Oh yeah, Lizzie Borden, didn't
Right.
she kill her mom or something,
Right.
in that nursery rhyme and jumping
Right.
rope? But that's about it. Now,
Right.
there's nothing wrong with that.
Right.
That's basically kind of true. But there's the what's underneath there, the different layers is just as amazing. We were talking before. I've never been to Fall River.
Yeah.
I would love to go to Fall River. I'd go straight to the house, and I would check in that night. I'm not a ghosty guy, but I'd stay the night in the bed and breakfast just to see if something happened.
Yeah.
Just to see how it felt. I would love to walk up those steps and look around and see where it all happened. And the next day I'd go right over to I think it's the Bolton County, whatever that is, Historical Society, where you can view a lot of the things, and that's be a lot of fun.
It would be fun, wouldn't it?
And I would do all
and
that.
the notoriety in the Boston papers. I mean, it was.
And I would do all those things. I'd satisfy my curiosity, and then I'd come home and I'd say, I don't know a darn thing more about Lizzie Borden than I knew before I left, but I've been to the bed and breakfast.
You would have had a good time.
That would be a great time.
If you go, be sure to take us with you, take photos, and come back and talk to us, okay?
I'm going to, yeah.
That's great. Well, let me see if we have any questions. I'm going to give people, if you have questions, audience, please type them now. We'll give Larry a few more minutes here.
I'd like to know if people think that justice was done, or now remember when I say justice is done, that's
a different thing.
That's a different thing than whether she did it or not.
Yes.
That the question is whether because the standard was the same, proof beyond a reasonable doubt.
Right.
That was the standard. And
So what do you think out there?
I'd like to know what people think.
Give us a few opinions. Was justice served? We'll give you a few minutes to answer that. Get on there and answer. Was justice served?
The other thing, lots of other things, but one of them is, over the years, lots of rumors have started. Crazy rumors have started. None of them have any foundation really in any solid evidence, but they're out there.
Right.
For example, Lizzie must have taken off all her clothes,
Right.
killed her parents.
With the coat.
Yeah, right.
With the coat. That's
Right.
why I asked about the coat,
Right.
because that came up in that context.
Yep, and killed all her parents somehow, cleaned up. Imagine had to be blood everywhere, but there wasn't. So then there should be evidence of blood being cleaned up
Right.
or wiped away or whatever, but evidently there wasn't. There's lots of rumors about illicit relationships between Lizzie, her uncle, remember, who was at house, stayed the night before.
He'd been there and then left that morning.
Whose alibi checked out. Well, did it really check out? And okay, or Emma, who was gone that night, remember?
Right.
But there's always a rumor that no, she snuck back and committed the crime and then went back, and that's why she didn't, that's why they reached her by telegraph. Or Maggie, the maid. There was some relationship, somebody saw something, somebody had something over another person, and so they kept her quiet. And of course, there's always been the rumor of incest between the father and the two daughters, and the bad blood, and not to mention the issues of the finances.
The stepmother. Living at a lower level than their relatives.
Yeah, that's right.
And the fact that Lizzie bought a house almost immediately up on the hill where she.
Right, and I think over, kind of hanging as a cloud over all this, as dumb as this sounds, you can't help but think that there's this idea that there's these two ladies who never married. Okay, there's something about that, isn't there? People say, I think, what happened? They never married. Lizzie never married. She has something horrible that she can't overcome, that people know, that people suspect. I really think that played a big part throughout her life, and she overcame that and lived another 40 years. But I just think that's as part of the allure.
That would speak to the incest issue, wouldn't it? If both women had been abused.
It might very well.
Yeah.
And remember that I think it was Lizzie who had been out of town shortly before and came back and didn't go home right away. Stayed at like a boarding house or someone with friends for 3 or 4 days before she went home. Well, what kind of behavior is that?
Well, and they had separate living quarters almost within the same house.
And they locked.
Yes, and she put a dresser door in front
That's
of it.
right.
That
It's
yes,
a little bit creepy, and they lock it, and the locks don't work, and if
yeah,
you
and
look
then he
at,
would leave the key out as if to taunt them.
and then that's right, and then when you look at those photographs, and you in the very narrow small rooms, but you
Right.
walk up that to the stairs to the second level, and when you get so that your eyes are level with the floor, you can see over into the room where Mrs. Borden's body, and you can see the feet at the end of the bed, and you can see the body. But yet Maggie testified that right before that, when her father came home, that Lizzie was up on the second floor, remember, and she was chuckling about how the door was locked, so she had to help him. Well, that means she's on the second floor, and that means the lady had already been killed. But it's all very strange.
It is all
It's
very
all
strange.
very, very strange. But something's funny is going on in that house. Who locks all their rooms from the inside? Remember, Lizzie was suspected of stealing from her own parents.
Yeah.
Not to mention shoplifting.
Yeah.
Not to mention going to the store and trying to buy poison. Really?
Right.
The day before?
Yeah,
Very, very, very odd.
very odd.
Very suspicious.
Yeah, it is. It's a fun enigma to play with,
It
isn't it?
is. Yeah, it sure is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, people are thinking that justice was served. Guilty as heck. Yes, justice was done, but mental illness. I truly believe in the innocence theory, in the incest theory.
Oh, really? Yeah.
Yeah. Boarded up. Ah, interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Why would you
This-
lock?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you. This was just a lot of fun.
It's always my pleasure.
Yeah.
And I like to read, and as everybody does, our participants like to read, but forming your own opinion and making them known, that's the fun part.
Yeah.
So I don't know anything more than anybody else does, but I like to have my opinions. It's a lot of fun.
Well, I'll tell you, this delving into these trials really opens up history for me from a very interesting angle. Mm-hmm. And I've really appreciated that. And the more that you get into it, the more questions keep coming up, like the whole issue of women. And
Yeah.
I do want to bring you back and to address that, because I think if you could, point us into to some literature to read and some things to watch. It's just a really fascinating question, and like I say, the majority of our viewers are women, so it really struck home.
Very good. Well, I'm happy to offer my 2 cents. I'll be here anytime you like.
That's great.
Thanks.
Well, thank you, Larry, very much, and thank you all for joining us this wonderful afternoon, and have a happy Thanksgiving coming up, and we will see you in the spring. I think Larry will come back after the holiday season, and we'll do some more of this. Until then, we'll say
Bye.
goodnight. Bye.